On a crisp September morning, the mailboxes of Oak Hollow bloomed with lavender rule packets, scented, signed in swirly cursive, and laminated for spiritual longevity. They arrived all at once, tucked under red flags and resting atop morning newspapers, their pastel sheen catching the low Colorado sun like a warning disguised as a welcome. The envelopes gave off a whiff of eucalyptus that lingered in the air even after the papers were taken inside. Tom Delaney stood on his porch in a brown cardigan and house slippers, sipping coffee and watching the neighborhood react. Some packets were tossed without being opened, others skimmed with a frown, but Tom took his inside, laid it flat on the dining table, and turned on the light over his reading chair like he was settling in for a court deposition. "Smells like eucalyptus and trouble," he muttered to Harold, his aging basset hound, who responded with a grunt before resuming his nap. The document, titled WA Aesthetic Rebalancing Guidelines, read more like a spiritual manifesto than a neighborhood update. There were sections on visual harmony, approved color schemes for porch furniture, mailbox paint codes, and something called driveway flow integrity. Each page was laminated and corner-rounded, as if to imply permanence. The signature at the bottom of every page, in violet ink, was unmistakable: Karen Whitmore, WA President. Karen had been elected only 3 weeks earlier, a surprise victory during the sparsely attended end-of-summer meeting, mostly thanks to her Harmony for Hollow campaign. She had promised soft lighting, softer voices, and a total reevaluation of what belonging looked like from the curb. That afternoon, Karen began her rounds. She walked the sidewalks like a mall manager on inspection, clipboard in one hand, pen clicking with judgment. Dressed in an ivory linen blazer over yoga wear and sporting an aggressively serene smile, she stopped in front of houses, tilted her head, and made notes. Occasionally, she paused to straighten a potted plant or readjust a wind chime. Hank Morelli watched her from the doorway of his cafe, wiping his hands on a rag. "She's got a spreadsheet in that thing," he told a regular. "Bet you $10. Inside, the cafe smelled of meatloaf and brewed Folgers. The stools by the counter creaked when sat upon, and the window behind the cash register had a faded sticker that read, "Voted Best Pie in County 2007. By the time Tom strolled in, a few neighbors were already sharing observations. "She knocked on my door to ask if I'd consider switching my doormat. Said the font on welcome was too aggressive," said Mrs. Flannery. "She called my porch railing emotionally uneven," muttered Joe, the gardener. Tom listened, quiet as usual, and sat near the window with his refillable cup. Hank poured without asking. "She's eyeing your truck, you know," Hank said. Tom didn't respond. The truck in question, a 1978 Ford, had been parked in the same spot for 15 years. It was clean, sturdy, and wore its faded paint like a well-earned scar. Tom had driven it on patrol for most of his last decade in office. He kept the keys hung on a hook shaped like a trout inside the front door. Becca arrived later that evening, suitcase in hand and hair tied back. She was in town for a research sabbatical, which she described as a combination of peace and data collection. Tom hugged her with one arm and offered her the bigger bedroom. By dusk, the wind had picked up, and a few loose leaves clattered across the porch. Tom stepped outside to check the mailbox again. This time, something was waiting on the windshield of his truck. A laminated notice. Lavender, of course. Reminder. Vehicle violates driveway flow symmetry. Please reposition or remove within 72 hours to avoid documentation escalation. KW. He read it once, then folded it cleanly in half and slipped it into his shirt pocket. Harold wagged his tail lazily at the door. That night, at dinner, Tom didn't bring up the notice. Becca talked about urban zoning conflicts in Portland and the sociology of yard design. Tom listened, nodded, and refilled her tea when it got low. The next morning, as the sun crept back over the rooftops, Tom walked out with his coffee and looked at the truck. He opened the passenger door, reached into the glove box, and pulled out a small black case. Inside, nestled in felt, was his old sheriff's badge. Still polished, still heavy. He walked to the driver's side, opened the door, and placed it carefully on the dashboard. The angle caught just enough light to glint through the windshield. Tom took a step back and nodded to himself. Harold settled on the front steps again, watching a squirrel chatter from a branch above. Karen passed by 5 minutes later, clipboard tucked under one arm. She paused when she saw the badge, then adjusted her scarf. She made no notes. Tom watched from inside, hand on his coffee mug, eyes steady. This wasn't over. Before sunrise, Tom's truck disappears from the driveway, leaving behind tire marks and a small garden gnome knocked sideways. The first thing Tom noticed that morning wasn't the missing truck, it was the way Harold barked. Just once, short and sharp, then went silent. Tom stepped onto the porch, coffee in hand, slippers soft against the wood. The air was still cool, not quite cold, and the smell of someone's early bacon drifted from a few houses down. Then he saw the gnome. It lay face down, a foot from the edge of the driveway, half buried in disturbed gravel. Behind it, a dark trail arced across the stones like a wound, vanishing where the road curved toward Maple Ridge. The truck was gone. Becca came outside still tying her sweatshirt, one eyebrow lifted. Morning ritual changed? Tom didn't answer right away. He took a slow breath, looked at the gouge marks again, then pointed at the empty space. Becca's eyes followed. Was it towed? Looks like it. Without a notice? Tom gave a single nod, then turned and went inside. By the time Becca followed him in, he was at the phone, punching buttons with deliberate precision. The town's clerk answered on the third ring and confirmed what Tom already suspected: no record of any official order. No municipal towing, no tickets, no street work scheduled. Just another quiet Oak Hollow morning, if you ignored the missing Ford. At Hank's cafe, the news had already arrived ahead of them. "You don't tow a sheriff's truck without getting the whole town's attention," Hank said, sliding 2 mugs toward Tom and Becca. "Truck go willingly?" Tom sipped. "Didn't leave a note." Hank leaned on the counter. "Heard someone spotted a rig near Elm Street before sunrise. No markings. Looked like one of those flatbeds you rent for highway pickups." Becca had her laptop open before the sentence ended. Her fingers danced while her lemon bars cooled beside her on a folded napkin. "There's only one towing outfit within 50 miles that doesn't use local dispatch. Enlightened Tow Solutions. They're based in Phoenix. No state license in Colorado. No active contracts listed." Tom raised an eyebrow. "Sounds homemade." "Made," Hank offered, reaching under the counter. He slid over a slim binder with duct tape on the spine and a coffee stain across the top. "Bylaws. The real ones. Back from before Karen's time. Only the board can authorize third-party services, and that requires a vote." Tom flipped to the page Hank had dog-eared. The clause was clear. WA funds couldn't be spent on outside services without a recorded decision at a public meeting. No vote, no tow. Back at the house, Karen's latest newsletter had arrived in mailboxes and inboxes alike. Becca pulled it up on her screen. The subject line read, "Visual renewal for driveway congestion." Tom read aloud, his voice flat. "Even icons must realign with beauty. In a modern neighborhood, legacy must learn to flow." Becca snorted. "That's not poetry. That's pretense." Tom didn't respond. He gathered his keys, slipped on a light jacket, and nodded to Harold, who barely opened one eye. "Going to find it." The impound lot was tucked behind a discount flooring warehouse off Route 7, flanked by a row of storage units and a fence that had once been chain link but now sagged like an old hammock. The office was closed. A single man sat on a plastic chair near the gate, smoking a vape that smelled vaguely like burnt oranges. Tom held out his ID. "Looking for a green, '78 Ford. Brought in early this morning." The man glanced up. "Ain't listed here." Tom didn't blink. "You sure?" The man hesitated, then stood. "Lemme check the yard." 5 minutes later, Tom stood in front of his truck. It had 3 fresh scratches along the driver's side, a chip in the rear taillight, and the side mirror was gone. He took out his phone and began snapping pictures. Every angle, every mark. He walked the perimeter, noting the absence of security cameras and the lack of any visible business license. The man returned. "Look, we just do pickups. Lady said it was WA approved." "Lady give you paperwork?" "Just a code to open the gate. Prepaid." Tom kept taking pictures. "Did she wear lavender?" The man blinked. "And a scarf." Tom nodded once, then returned to his truck, slid behind the wheel, and started the engine. It sputtered slightly, then settled into its familiar low rumble. Back in Oak Hollow, Hank was running a fall wreath special, half-price apple cider and a free coffee for anyone who had received a citation that week. A dozen folks qualified. Most of them lingered near the window, watching Tom pull back into his driveway. Becca came out, arms folded. Did she at least send a receipt? Tom killed the engine. She sent a message. Becca didn't ask what it was. Instead, she turned back into the house and walked toward her laptop. On the counter, her lemon bars sat cooling, untouched. She opened a new folder, titled it in all caps, and dragged over the files. Bylaws, screenshots, newsletter quotes, towing company data, photos of the scratches, and a copy of the HOA's conflict of interest policy. The folder name blinked for a moment, then locked into place. WA violations, evidence archive. Karen installs motion-activated lights that chirp "Namaste" every time someone walks past her sidewalk. The first chirp came at 6:12 a.m. Becca heard it through her bedroom window and sat bolt upright, unsure if she was dreaming or if a Buddhist doorbell had become self-aware. Tom, already up and buttering toast, didn't flinch when the next soft "Namaste" drifted through the front door screen. "They're motion activated," he said, handing her a mug. "Trigger at 20 feet. Sound travels more." By the time Oak Hollow was fully awake, the entire block had been introduced to Karen's newest installation, 6 solar lights embedded along her sidewalk, each programmed to emit a gentle greeting in a tone eerily close to automated meditation apps. A small sign beside the hedge read, "Let peace begin with pavement." Becca sipped her coffee and muttered, "The louder the harmony, the worse the storm." Out front, Karen stood beside the new display, clipboard under one arm, chatting with Ted, the WA assistant. Ted was nodding politely, though his eyes darted toward the sidewalk every time the chirp triggered. Tom could almost hear his soul wither. Late September had crept in with a first frost advisory. Porch mums wore blankets. Joe the gardener had switched from tank tops to denim jackets. The leaves had become crisp underfoot, and sweater weather arrived right on schedule. But with it came a chill that had less to do with temperature and more to do with tension. Flyers appeared overnight, taped to the community boards and slipped under doors. WA Harmony Hour, mandatory presence encouraged. Karen's name was at the bottom, embossed in lilac ink. The event promised cider, conflict mediation, and a presentation on recoloring the street palette. On the day of the event, Becca stayed back, opting to sort through WA logs she'd requested from Ted for neighborhood research. She scanned rows of entries, citations, expenditures, notes from meetings, and noticed inconsistencies. Citations dated before committee votes. Expenses with no signature trail. One entry marked, "Paving Serenity," listed a dollar amount just under the discretionary spending cap. Across the street, Karen was in full presentation mode, issuing citations from behind a folding table with a lace runner and a bowl of boiled chestnuts. She handed one to a Vietnam veteran for non-neutral flowerpots, citing that their cobalt glaze disrupted driveway tranquility. The man's expression didn't change, but his wife pulled the citation from his hand and tore it neatly in half. Inside Hank's cafe, Tom leaned on the counter while Hank flipped through a folder of old newsletters. "She's quoting bylaws that didn't exist 3 years ago," Hank muttered, pointing at the margins. "See this? We voted down the solar ornament clause. She's acting like it passed with applause." Mrs. Flannery arrived just before sunset, wearing a crocheted shawl and carrying a weathered envelope. She pressed it into Becca's hands and whispered, "In case I disappear from gardening club." Becca opened it at the kitchen table while Tom read through Hank's newsletter stack. Inside the envelope were photocopies of budget documents, dated and signed 2 weeks before the WA had formally voted on any new expenses. One stood out. An authorization for towing services, filed under Community Safety Enhancements. It bore Karen's signature and a second one Becca didn't recognize, scrawled, rushed, and stamped with a notary seal that had expired last year. "Was this public?" Becca asked, turning the page. Tom took the papers, reading slowly. "No." He tapped them into alignment on the edge of the table. Outside, the Namaste chirped again, followed by the sound of someone loudly coughing in protest. Tom didn't smile. He just stared at the document, his eyes scanning every line twice. "It's starting to smell like a case file." Karen patrols the neighborhood like a lavender-scented general, clipboard in hand, citing fence angles and mailbox tone dissonance. By Monday morning, Oak Hollow looked like a postcard dipped in cinnamon. Pumpkins lined porches, flannel shirts fluttered on clotheslines, and straw scarecrows leaned proudly in flower beds, each one declaring a quiet sort of resistance. The first week of October had turned the town golden. But Karen Whitmore, it seemed, was determined to paint it lavender again. She moved with purpose down Maple Lane, her scarf trailing behind like a victory banner, clipboard hugged to her chest. In just 2 days, she had issued 11 citations. Tom counted them on the community bulletin board like they were entries in a lottery. "She's issuing tickets faster than the town fair raffle," he said, adjusting the turkey baster he'd been using to dice the railing. The morning frost had finally arrived, crisping the leaves and slowing Harold's usual shuffle. Joe the gardener stood nearby, arms folded. "She cited my scarecrow," he grunted. Said the hat was too jaunty for harvest dignity. Inside Hank's cafe, protest simmered under the smell of cinnamon rolls. Mr. Patel had received a warning for excessive solar gnome clustering. The Wilson twins were ordered to reposition their Halloween display because the witch glared toward a communal path. Even Mrs. Flannery had been flagged. Her wind chime, apparently, disrupted the oral ambiance of the street. Becca, armed with her laptop and a growing file titled Lavender Incidents, began cataloging each complaint. She matched citation times to WA meeting minutes and quickly noticed a pattern. The fines and warnings had outpaced any formal vote. There were no motions recorded, no member consent. Just line after line of Karen's pen, flowing through town like a perfumed river. Hank, sorting receipts behind the counter, called out, "Her training was an online webinar, right? 2 hours. Sponsored by a landscaping blog. From 2012. Becca didn't even look up. She cites sources with more authority than she holds. That afternoon, Mrs. Flannery dropped by with a thermos of spiced cider and a sealed envelope. "It's called Project Lavender," she whispered to Becca, glancing around like someone might be listening through the hydrangeas. "I printed it off her old Pinterest board before she locked it. It's ambitious." Inside was a multi-page vision outline. Sketches of gated community entrances, renderings of community-mandated porch seating, and a color wheel labeled Emotional Landscape Calibration. Karen's signature was printed at the bottom of each page with the tagline, "Let order be the view." At home, Tom sat in the den flipping through another stack of WA paperwork when something caught his eye. A contract, dated 2 weeks before the tow incident, authorizing services from a firm called Elevated Street Strategies, LLC. The listed contact? Charles Whitmore, Karen's cousin, last seen managing a failed smoothie franchise in Arizona. Tom raised an eyebrow. Becca turned in her chair and immediately began sorting cells in her spreadsheet. Within an hour, they had a color-coded file charting citations against meeting records, flagging expenses with no vote, and highlighting repeated payments just under the required approval threshold. It was a mosaic of missteps, all signed in lavender ink. Down the block, Ted the assistant walked slowly past Karen's latest poster. WA Vision Session, attendance mandatory. Karen's message arrived via email and printed mail. Your presence reflects your alignment. Absence will be interpreted as resistance. Tom read it twice. Then he chuckled once, dry and low. She's finally said the quiet part out loud. The clubhouse smells like lavender oil and tension. Karen's slideshow is titled, Manifesting Order, Aesthetic Governance for the Soul. Folding chairs creaked like protesters every time someone shifted. The overhead lights flickered just enough to be irritating, and someone had tried to mask the scent of mildew with over-applied lavender diffuser sticks positioned under every vent. A long folding table was draped in sheer fabric and anchored at the corners with small bowls of amethyst crystals. Behind it, Karen stood in a pale purple pantsuit, remote control in hand, beaming like she'd just been nominated for a daytime Emmy. Tom sat beside Becca in the third row, arms crossed, thermos resting on one knee. Becca leaned toward him, voice barely above a whisper. "If she starts chanting, I'm unplugging the projector." The title screen glowed behind Karen, a curling script over a watercolor lotus. Manifesting Order, Aesthetic Governance for the Soul. The first slide appeared with a chime that caused at least 2 neighbors to flinch. Karen began her address with a deep breath and a sweeping gesture. Oak Hollow has long existed as a visual patchwork, vibrant, yes, but chaotic. My goal as president is not to erase, but to align. She clicked again. A chart appeared. It was unclear what it measured, something about neighborhood vibrational tiers, but it had a bar for each street and a frowning emoji on the cul-de-sac. Becca's fingers tapped her thigh. Tom gave her a subtle nod. As Karen transitioned into a monologue about the resonance of shared shutters, Becca stood politely. "Excuse me, Bylaw Section 4.7 requires itemized financial reporting for all projects exceeding $500. I've submitted 3 requests and received no reply." Karen's smile faltered for a split second, then returned with reinforced serenity. "Transparency," she said, "is part of our journey. But not everything can be measured in dollars. Some investments are energetic." "Itemized energy, then," Becca said. A few chuckles rolled through the back row. Tom raised a hand. "We'd like to see the spending reports tied to the vision session and any associated service contracts." Karen clicked again. A photo of a koi pond faded onto the screen. "What's important is that we move forward as a community. Dwelling in the granular details of the past keeps us from blooming." Becca turned to Hank, who was already kneeling by the clubhouse's aging media hub. He connected a small projector with practiced calm, and within seconds, a spreadsheet appeared, cold and unambiguous. Dates, amounts, vendors. The name of Karen's Cousins LLC, Elevated Street Strategies, repeated 6 times, each one marked, "No vote on record." Karen's voice sharpened. "This is highly irregular." Ted shifted in his seat. "Actually," he said, voice soft but steady, "I was asked to notarize 3 of those forms. Karen told me the board had pre-approved them. But we hadn't met yet." All eyes turned to Karen. She inhaled through her nose. "We do what's best for the aesthetic path. Not everyone will understand right away." Then Tom reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a phone, placing it face up on the folding table. He tapped once, and a voicemail began to play. "Yeah, I need that truck gone before sunrise. Don't wait for WA approval, I'll handle the paperwork. Just get it done quietly." The voice was unmistakably Karen's. A few gasps punctuated the silence. One of the lemon bars on the refreshment table deflated with a soft thump, like it too had given up. Karen stood perfectly still. At the side of the room, the WA treasurer stood slowly, her sensible pumps clicking against the linoleum. She adjusted her glasses and looked around the room with calm finality. "I believe we need to vote on immediate suspension." Karen appears the next day in a white pantsuit and giant sunglasses, declaring herself emotionally exonerated. She strutted down Maple Lane just past 8, arm outstretched like a cruise director greeting a tour group no one had signed up for. The pantsuit was starch white, the sunglasses oversized and tinted rose. Around her neck hung a lanyard holding a laminated card that read, "Vortex-calibrated WA Executive, Level Gold." Tom watched from the porch, sipping his morning coffee. Harold grunted once and rolled over. Across the street, a plastic skeleton from the Wilson twins' Halloween display toppled in the wind and lay motionless, as if stunned by what it had just witnessed. At Hank's cafe, the regulars were already exchanging theories. "She's spiraling faster than a dollar store wind spinner in a thunderstorm," Hank said, thumbing through the mail bin labeled, "Local Only." He added a sign to the register, "Pumpkin pie $2, Karen updates free." The town had changed overnight. Flyers from the WA Vision session still fluttered on bulletin boards, but now they had handwritten notes scribbled over them. Rescind. Review. Re-elect. Someone had added googly eyes to Karen's printed headshot. A chalk message on the sidewalk outside the post office read, "We believe in driveways." Becca's phone buzzed mid-morning. A text from Ted. "It's not safe to email. Meet me behind the gazebo at lunch." He arrived looking like he hadn't slept, clutching a USB drive and a reusable bag full of folded papers. "I was supposed to delete these," he whispered. "She made me sign a mindfulness waiver before every meeting. Said it was to align intent." Becca pocketed the drive and handed him a homemade muffin. Ted looked like he might cry. Back at home, they opened the files. Emails, attachments, and time-stamped memos all pointed to a clear pattern. Karen had altered meeting records, reworded board votes, and used discretionary funds to hire a home energy consultant named Sky Waverly to restore vortex positivity to her office. The invoice, filed under spiritual architecture, was marked urgent. Tom took the papers and drove them straight to the small government office on Main Street, where Code Enforcement Officer Marla Jennings worked Thursdays. She blinked at the folder, adjusted her glasses, and said, "Well, that's a new one." Later that day, Hank posted a new flyer on the cafe's corkboard. Fall festival equals no WA speeches. Just pie. By evening, casseroles began appearing on porches. Anonymous neighbors dropped off lasagnas, stews, and one oddly elegant quiche labeled, "For Courage." Someone knitted a potholder that read "Stay Neutral" in blocky letters. The knitting group renamed itself Concerned Citizens for WA Sanity. Karen responded by emailing the community a notice with a pink background and Comic Sans font, declaring the previous night's vote spiritually void. She warned of resistance pockets breeding disharmony, and promised a new dawn of enforced elegance. The email concluded with a glittery gif of a phoenix rising. That night, the WA board met without her. They called the vote official. Karen was suspended from all duties, and the Code Enforcement Office froze all discretionary spending until an audit could be completed. Ted, seated at the far end of the table, raised his hand and asked whether WA email passwords should be changed. The board nodded unanimously. Tom didn't say much. He simply stood, offered his thermos to Marla as thanks, and left without fanfare. At exactly 3:14 a.m., the neighborhood woke to a rustling, not of wind or raccoons, but of paper. Every mailbox received a new letter, hand-delivered and printed on lilac stationery. "This isn't over. I have allies in high-frequency spaces. KW. Karen parks a rented U-Haul in her driveway, not to leave, but to unload pink lawn signs reading, "IAM the aesthetic order." The truck arrived just after sunrise, its engine coughing once before shutting off with finality. Karen emerged from the driver's seat in a gold-stitched poncho and matching suede boots, her hair twisted into a braid thick enough to anchor a canoe. The first pink sign came out of the truck bed with dramatic flair. Within 15 minutes, she had planted 6 of them, on her lawn, the median near the playground, even one in front of Hank's cafe. Each one shimmered in the early light, the words outlined in glitter that caught and threw back the sun like disco philosophy. Tom and Becca stood on the porch, watching as if they'd stumbled onto performance art. Harold, flat against the rug, refused to move even for breakfast. "When someone's got to write their own title in glitter," Tom said, "they've already lost the job." Karen wasn't done. By noon, she had erected a small archway on the public green space, plastic ivy strung across PVC piping and a banner that read, "WA Heritage Meditation Garden, a sacred rebalancing experience." Underneath, she placed 2 folding chairs, a bowl of quartz stones, and a battery-powered incense fan. Flyers appeared next. Karen Whitmore, reinstated WA Visionary, by cosmic affirmation. She'd listed a time for her spiritual re-inauguration ceremony, and invited those aligned with aesthetic truth to witness her return. Not a single person showed. By 3 o'clock, Hank had taped up his own flyer outside the cafe. "Free cider for every neighbor who stays away." It emptied his entire crockpot. Ted, now fully unburdened and wearing a hoodie that read, "Reclaim the board," stopped by Becca's makeshift command center at the dining table. He handed over the final batch of scanned documents, every permit request Karen had filed since spring. Becca cross-referenced them with city archives and circled 24 inconsistencies. One permit had a forged planner's signature, another was missing zoning attachments. Most were simply marked, pending, but had been acted on anyway. Tom forwarded the file to Marla at Code Enforcement. She replied within 30 minutes, "Bringing zoning inspector. Be there at 5. Meanwhile, Karen's U-Haul had been transformed into a mobile altar. She parked it sideways on the green, opened both rear doors, and lined the inside with scarves, votive candles, and a looping playlist of ambient pan flute music. She wore a sash that read, "WA Visionary," and passed out lavender tea to no one. Kids in Halloween costumes began drifting through, one dressed as a traffic cone, another as a haunted WA violation. They posed for photos near Hank's booth, where he handed out drainage maps for dummies, and let people sign a giant poster that read, "Let the pond flow no more." At 5 on the dot, a silver Prius pulled up. Marla stepped out in her usual navy windbreaker, followed by a man in khakis with a clipboard and measuring wheel. He introduced himself as Roger, zoning inspector for the county. Karen greeted them both with a bow and an unsolicited cup of herbal elixir. "You arrive in the perfect moment," she said. "The earth chakra of this space is finally aligned." Roger looked at the koi pond she had dug the day before, lined with pink stone, solar-powered lotus lights flickering in the breeze. He pointed toward a nearby marker. "This is a storm drainage easement," he said flatly. "You built a water feature in a runoff path." Karen blinked, then raised her chin. "It's not a water feature. It's a reflection sanctuary." Roger didn't flinch. "If it rains tonight, the koi won't make it, and neither will your project." The town picnic hums with laughter and casserole debates. Karen's house sits quiet, shutters drawn, flamingos missing. Oak Hollow's green lot was never greener. Late October wrapped the town in a warm glow of plaid blankets, crackling leaves, and the smell of cinnamon apples carried on every breeze. Bunting stretched from tree to tree, and long folding tables groaned under the weight of crockpots and tinfoil-covered pies. Kids played leaf tag near the creek, their laughter echoing off the cottonwoods. Someone strummed a guitar under the gazebo, and a dog in a bumblebee costume snored beside the cider station. Tom stood near the edge of the picnic, a thermos in one hand and a plate of Hank's famous sausage-stuffed mushrooms in the other. Across the field, Becca chatted with Mrs. Flannery, who had brought a 3-layer casserole she refused to identify until it was completely gone. Karen's house, in contrast, sat still. Shutters closed, porch empty, no flamingos in sight. Even the meditation garden had been flattened, the koi relocated by the city to a legal pond outside town. Her mailbox, once the most bedazzled in 3 zip codes, was plain white again. "Funny how a missing truck brought the neighborhood back," Tom said, half to himself. Hank handed him a cup of cider. "Funny how a clipboard nearly tore it apart." Near the center tent, a small speaker crackled to life. Ted, now semi-famous in town for accidental whistleblowing, gave a short speech thanking the residents for choosing clarity over crystals. He kept it under 2 minutes and received polite applause and an apple pie. Becca stepped up next. Her laptop perched on a hay bale. She gave a 5-minute summary of her thesis titled, "Suburban Power and Resistance, a Case Study in WA Influence." It included charts, quotes, and one particularly damning slide labeled Karen's decorative spending versus federal guidelines. When it came time for closing remarks, Tom walked up to the mic with his thermos still in hand. He cleared his throat and said simply, "Good fences never made neighbors. Only rules did." Then he tipped his hat and walked back into the crowd. As the sun began to dip behind the cottonwoods, a small envelope peeked out of Tom's mailbox. He didn't recognize the handwriting at first, but the floral paper and the scent, somewhere between soap and citrus regret, gave it away. He read the letter silently, its script winding through phrases like forgiveness, cleansing vibrations, and WA visionaries are rarely understood in their time. It ended with a flourish and no signature, though none was needed. Tom walked over to the picnic fire pit, where someone was roasting marshmallows. Without ceremony, he fed the letter to the flames. It curled inward, smoked lavender, and vanished. The creek gurgled in the distance, calm again. Kids chased each other with felt leaves stuck to their sleeves, and casserole pans clinked as neighbors traded leftovers. Hank wandered down to the water's edge just as a gust of wind sent something pink drifting along the surface. A lone plastic lawn flamingo, wobbling like it had forgotten why it was here in the first place. "Let's leave it," Hank said with a grin. As a warning. The creek flowed quiet again, children's laughter rose in the autumn air, and Oak Hollow remembered the rhythm it once had before lavender mandates and glittering control. What began as one missing truck became a town's rediscovery of voice, truth, and the kind of neighborly strength that doesn't need a bylaw to stand tall. Power, when unchecked, may glitter, but it cannot glow. When rules are used for good, communities thrive. When they're misused, they crumble. Perhaps it's never too late to join hands with neighbors and say, gently but firmly, "That's enough." And somewhere downstream, a lone pink flamingo bobbed in the current, a quiet reminder that even absurdity has its limits.